This country in the Mediterranean has the best diet for longevity in all of the Mediterranean regions. And the way that we came to this answer is by looking at the level of risk reduction when this diet was implemented. By risk reduction, I mean, what does it look like when someone adheres to this diet very, very well? And what happens when someone adheres to this particular diet very, very well is they have the most risk reduction. So the country that we're talking about within the Mediterranean, just jumping right into it, it's Spain. Now you have the answer, you click off the video and you go about your merry way, but that's not how this channel rolls. This channel is all about getting into the granular. I want to understand why Spain is different. And I'm going to just open up a graph and put it on the screen right now. And this is interesting because this particular graph shows a few things. It shows the consumption of meat, fish, and eggs when you look at Spain, Italy, Greece, and then Chile's in there too because this particular graph is looking at some other things, not just Mediterranean. But Spain has a pretty significantly higher amount of meat, fish, and eggs. They're not consuming a ridiculous amount, but they are consuming more than the other Mediterranean regions. Now, let's table that for 1 second and let's look at a couple of studies that were part of a large review that was a mix of randomized control trials and epidemiological studies that was published not that long ago. Okay, 2 particular studies that were in that looked at the adherence to a Spanish Mediterranean diet and its impact, its level of risk reduction. So this study looked at 11,000 people that didn't have any kind of metabolic issues at all, okay? And it followed them around for, well, it didn't follow them around, but it followed up with them 7 or 8 years later after doing their diet, right? And they looked at who adhered to this Spanish Mediterranean diet the most. The stronger the adherence to the Spanish Mediterranean diet, there was up to a 67% reduction in mortality risk. 67% by adhering to the Spanish Mediterranean diet. Not to mention there was also a 37% less risk of abdominal obesity, instance, I guess in this case, 37% less instance, and a 27% less instance of metabolic syndrome. Now, you compare this to some of the other countries. I've done other videos that look at this. Italy and Greece did phenomenally well too. But take my word for it, when we look at this data, Spain had the highest risk reduction. So the more that people adhered to a Spanish Mediterranean, the better their overall mortality. So I do the digging and I'm just like, what's going on here? Like, what is it? Because overall, like macronutrient consumption is a little different. For example, like Italy is definitely higher in the carbohydrates, but not significantly higher than Spain. I'm not convinced that it's just veggie consumption and fiber consumption of the Mediterranean diet that makes it so good. I am much more inclined to think that it's fatty acid composition, right? It's the quality of the fats, and maybe the quality of the fats can help offset some of the potential negative that would come from a higher carbohydrate diet. That being said, these are regions that are active and the carbohydrates are probably not negatively impacting them that much. Carbohydrates, I'm not in this camp that's saying that carbohydrates are completely benign, but I'm also not in the camp of saying that carbohydrates are problematic either. I think it's relative to your activity and your movement because they are a fuel. And in Europe and in the Mediterranean, these people walk a lot and they can handle higher carbohydrate consumption. So when we adopt that in the US, it's not good because we're very sedentary. So with Spain, given that their fatty acid composition is very similar to Italy and very similar to Greece even, the only real big difference is the meat, egg, and fish consumption. Now, I do want to get into processed food for just a second as well, because Spain's processed food intake seems quite a bit different than, say, like Greece's. And I've talked about this in other videos too, but we're going to investigate a little bit more. Now, I put a link down below. You can skip through this if you want, but there is a link for Thrive Market, which is an online grocery store. They've been a sponsor on this channel for over half a decade, and it is a 30% off discount link. So for those that are trying to eat more of a Mediterranean style and have that influence into their home, I highly recommend it because you can log into Thrive, you can type in Mediterranean, so you can sort by foods that are going to be more Mediterranean style and be able to get your hands on like good olive oil, good things like that are going to have that Mediterranean influence without maybe some of the garbage that might be on the grocery store shelves claiming to be more Mediterranean. Also going to have things like cured meats and things like that that are quite good in the grand scheme of things if they are not hyper-processed with other preservatives and garbage. So there's a 30% off discount link through your entire first grocery order. So check them out after this video, plus you get a free $60 gift when you use that link. Not to mention, it does help this channel out. We don't ask for much. If you support our channel and you support our sponsors, it keeps us going. So I want to touch on processed food for just a second. Greece and Spain consume the same amount of processed food. Italy's an anomaly. They do not consume much processed food. But Spain and Greece consume the same amount of processed foods. However, Spain has 9 to 12% of its processed food consumption. It's one of its top 5 processed food consumption is sausage and cured meat. Have you ever had tapas before, right? So that makes sense. Whereas in Greece, sausages and cured meats aren't even in their top 5, right? So the majority of the Greek processed foods are going to be breads or bread products, not even bread. I don't consider bread in Europe real processed food. Bread products, crackers, they have sauces and margarines up in their top 5. Whereas in Spain, it's entirely different. So processed food is not all the same. For example, like a whey protein is considered a hyper-palatable, or I guess it's not hyper-palatable, but it's ultra-processed, right? I still consider that pretty good. So what's interesting when you look at the metabolic sphere of things, Spain seems to have some of the biggest metabolic positive impact with their Mediterranean diet. For example, in Greece, from a metabolic standpoint, adherence to the Greek Mediterranean diet only really improved diabetes outcomes by about 12%. Okay, whereas adhering to a Spanish Mediterranean diet, you had that 27% improvement or risk reduction in metabolic syndrome, which includes things like diabetes, right? But there's also significant differences in insulin resistance when you look at that. So my point in saying all of this is that adherence to that Spanish style with slightly more protein and slightly lower carbohydrates lends itself to a better metabolic health outcome, which we could take a lot of good things from the different Mediterranean regions, but the Spanish seem to have that part down. Now, I addressed this in another video, and I want to talk about it here too. Spain also seems to have a pretty high BMI. So they are definitely starting to have more of an increase in body mass index and possibly obesity. I don't have those metrics in front of me, and I haven't been able to find anything solid on that just yet. But it seems as though they have one of the higher levels of BMI. Could that be because of influence of certain kinds of processed food coming in there? I don't really have an answer for that. But that's the interesting thing is healthier metabolic impact, better all-cause mortality rates, yet BMI is still increasing. Could it possibly be that maybe there's more muscle mass? Because that could certainly influence BMI. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Because it's wild. BMI doesn't account for muscle mass. We're not going to DEXA scan all of these people and find out what their fat-free mass is. We might be able to do it with a small percentage of people. But we can't get a big picture. BMI, we can get large data on. And I want to touch on the cured meats for just a moment. People think that cured meats are going to be processed meat. And technically, they are categorized as such. And unfortunately, red meat gets roped into the processed category a lot. But processed meat is really things like bologna and not so good processed like meat product. There is nothing wrong with having prosciutto that is pure meat and salt, and that is considered processed. Just like cheese can be considered processed in some ways, whey protein can be considered processed in some ways. So the whole processed food category gets wildly skewed. So in the United States, we consume a ridiculous amount of processed foods and a ridiculous amount of not so good processed meat. And unfortunately, in Europe, sometimes the red meat gets grouped into that category of processed, when in reality, red meat consumption in the Mediterranean, the best way to categorize it is it's used infrequently, but infrequently can still literally mean once a day. It's just not, we're not making consistent products out of it like we might be in the United States. But the cured meats are considered processed as well, and all they really are is meat and salt. So the processed food intake number doesn't really tell us the full picture. And that's the perfect example when you look at Greece compared to Spain. Processed food levels are the exact same, but the quality and the type of processed food in Spain is wildly different than the processed food in Greece. So what's the takeaway from this? What can your diet look like? Well, we know the Mediterranean lifestyle is good. Sun exposure, walking, friends, family, community, these things. antioxidants. But what we want to focus on here, the common denominators. Instead of focusing constantly on your carbohydrate intake or quality, I want you to focus on your fatty acid quality. What kind of monounsaturated fats are you consuming? Are you consuming olive oils? Are you consuming even avocado oils, macadamia nut oils? Are you consuming small amounts of nuts and seeds throughout the day? Are you getting good quality fats? Are you consuming high amounts of saturated fat? Because the Mediterranean regions don't consume a lot of saturated fat. Are you consuming good amounts of good quality dairy? We're starting to see that C15 deficiencies coming from a lack of saturated fat from things like dairy can actually be a problem. So getting your saturated fat more so from good quality dairy might be a better route than getting it from, I don't know, partially hydrogenated oils and trans fats, and realistically, maybe even high amounts of red meat. Maybe it's better to get some of it from dairy. What do you know? Kind of what the Mediterranean regions do. Small amounts of fish, definitely high amounts of fruits, possibly high amounts of veggies, possibly high amounts of fiber, a good amount of protein coming from eggs and coming from fish and dairy, and decent amounts from lean meats. Makes a lot of sense. Lots of olive oil, lots of polyphenols, lots of coffee, lots of tea, lots of walking. I'll see you tomorrow.